Hello, second grade Smarties, and welcome to Wit and Wisdom Module 2, the American West, Lesson 27. Today, our pizza bite question is, what's happening in John Henry, an American Legend by Keats? So yesterday, we introduced our new legendary character, John Henry. And remember, legends are stories that are about real topics or people or places, but these stories are told over time, and sometimes people can add some very magical elements to these legends. So, as we are diving into the real John Henry and the legend of John Henry, let's take a look at some pictures about that tunnel that we learned about the first time we read John Henry's story. So, on the screen, you can see some pictures of the tunnel where John Henry and Lil Bill race against that steam-powered drill. So this is the tunnel that John Henry beat the machine at. And this is believed to be the tunnel. It might not be, but it's believed to be the tunnel. And we know after listening to the story the first time that after he raced this steam powered drill, this is where he probably died. So this is a picture of the tunnel. That is where he possibly raced the steam drill. And here is a plaque describing it. It says Big Bend Tunnel. The Great Tunnel of the C&O Railroad was started at Big Bend in 1870 and completed 3 years later. It is more than a mile long and now has a twin tunnel. Tradition makes this the scene of the steel driver's ballad, John Henry. So, as we are thinking about this new legend, we also have to think about the life around the real John Henry. So, John Henry is seen as a legend, but he was also a real person. So, here is our timeline that we have added to since we've started this module. And the last person we added was John Chapman, or Johnny Appleseed. And now in orange, we have John Henry being born between 1840 and 1850. We don't have a specific date. And then we also have right here Big Bend Tunnel, built from 1870 to 1873. And remember, based on the legend, after he drilled through that tunnel, drilled through that rock, that is where John Henry died. So it is possible that John Henry died between 1870 and 1873. Looking at this part of the timeline, what do you notice? What other events do you see in the same area where the Big Bend Tunnel was built? So remember, when we are thinking about our legends or what we're learning about during the early American West, we can associate or put together our thoughts about what else was happening during that time. So looking at this place where my little cursor is moving, what is something else that was happening during the time that Big Bend Tunnel was built? Pause the video and tell me in the Edpuzzle, what is an event that you see happening the same time that the Big Bend Tunnel was built? So something that I am seeing is that the Plains Indians at this time were forced into reservations. We learned that the land dried up after settlers started trying to farm on that land and the bison nearly died out. And the Comanche people, the tribe that the legend of the Blue Bonnet is based on, they were pushed out of Texas and forced to live on reservations in Oklahoma. So something that was happening at the same time that the Big Bend Tunnel was being built is that Native Americans were starting to be forced to live on those reservations. And a lot of the railroads where these trains went through happened on Native American lands. So keep that in the back of your mind as we are learning about John Henry. How does his story relate to what we are learning about the early American West? All right, so our pizza bite question today, our content question is what's happening in John Henry? So we are going to listen to this version of John Henry's story for a second time. As we are reading, we are going to pause and answer some questions. So be listening and watching what is happening on these pages. Are you ready? We're going to talk about our character, our setting, and 3 major events that happens in this story. Here we go. A hush settled over the hills. The sky swirled soundlessly round the moon. The river stopped murmuring. The wind stopped whispering, and the frogs and the owls and the crickets fell silent, all watching and waiting and listening. Then the river roared. The wind whispered and whistled and sang. The frogs croaked, the owls hooted, and all the crickets chirped. Welcome, welcome, echoed through the hills. What is our setting on this page? What is the setting at the very beginning of the story? Tell me in the puzzle. So looking at the illustrations in the first word, a hush settled over the hills. So looking at the illustration, we can see that there is a house on the hill. And John Henry was born with a hammer in his hand. Bang, 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 rang little John Henry's hammer through the cabin as he crawled about. What's that rascal up to now? His mother chuckled, and before she knew it, he was big enough to help her around the house. So we know our main character is John Henry, but what is the first event? What is the first thing that we learn that John Henry does? Think back to this page. What happens first after John Henry was born? Tell me in the puzzle. So the first event that we learn is that John Henry was born with a hammer in his hand. Oh my goodness. And that illustration shows us too. As he grew up, he did a man's work with his father. One day, John Henry thought, I'm taller and stronger than anyone around. It's time I went out into the world. He said goodbye to his mother and father, and off he went. He worked on farms and in cotton fields, but all that was too tame. So he got himself a job on a riverboat. One stormy night, the ship plowed through the darkness. Suddenly, the big steel rod that turned the paddle wheel broke. The wheel stopped turning. Smash went the rod through the bottom of the ship. Pump water, shouted the captain. Get to port before we sink. John Henry leaped to the paddle wheel crank. He seized it, pushed and grunted and pulled. Slowly, the giant wheel turned. With all his strength, he kept it turning. Lord Almighty, help us, someone whispered in that long, dark night. As day broke, they sighted shore and pulled into port. A thunderous cheer went up for John Henry. All right, on these pages, what is the second event that we learn about John Henry? What happens when he gets his first job on the riverboat? What happens on this page? Tell me in the puzzle. We learn that he saves the ship and the men on that ship by turning that giant wheel. And you can see John Henry jumping to the wheel. So he saves the men on the riverboat that he worked on. So there's that second main event. John Henry felt a new excitement in the air. Men were talking of railroads being built from the Atlantic to the Pacific. They're going to lay those tracks over rivers, across prairies and deserts, and right through mountains, and through Indian lands and stampeding buffalo herds and badlands. Goodbye, boys, cried John Henry. I'm going to swing me a hammer on them beautiful new tracks. My hands are just itching to hold a hammer again, John Henry said. He tried one for size and laughed. It sure does feel fine. how he drove those spikes, singing to the clanging of his hammer. The men joined in, their voices singing, hammers ringing, and John Henry's gang was in the lead as day after day the tracks moved steadily westward. So John Henry spends his time on the riverboat. What is the next event that happens? What does he move on to do? Where does he start working next? Tell me in the puzzle. He starts working on the railroad, right? And he starts swinging his hammer on those railroad tracks. So we have so far learned our setting, our character, and our first event was that John Henry was born with a hammer in his hand. Our next event is that he worked on a riverboat and saved the ship and the people on the ship, and then he moved on to working on railroads. Rising across their path was a sprawling mountain range. Its snow-capped peaks reached high into the clouds. "We'll have to tunnel through," said his friend Little Bill. "It'll be awfully dangerous, but could be cave-in," someone put in. "That suits me fine," said John Henry. "Me too," added Little Bill. "Here's how we'll do it, boys," the foreman called out. "A couple of men will drive a hole into the rock. Then the powder men will put dynamite into the hole and explode it. The others will cart the loose rock away. We'll do this again and again until we have a tunnel right through this mountain. And it's going to be a real big tunnel, boys, big enough for a giant locomotive pulling one of them long strings of trains. All right, boys, blast away." Deep into the mountain they worked, as John Henry's singing echoed through the tunnel. The powder men got ready to blast more rock. They filled a hole with dynamite, put in a long fuse, and lit it. "Run, men!" cried the foreman. They all scrambled back, ready to dash clear of the blast. At that instant came a great cracking and rumbling, and the entire tunnel trembled around them. "It's a cave-in! We're trapped!" There was no place to run. The fuse burned closer to the dynamite. John Henry was nearest the fuse. He ran to put it out, but tripped and fell. "Ooh, I'm hurt bad," he groaned. "I can't get up." The fuse burned farther out of reach. Others rushed toward it, but they were too far away. Suddenly, John Henry remembered. He still had his hammer in his hand. Down came the hammer, smack on the burning tip. The fuse was out. Danger past. Sighs of relief filled the smoky tunnel. "Whew! Help me up, boys," mumbled John Henry. Clearing their way through the cave-in, the men carried him to safety. So what happens when John gets caught in the cave-in? What does he do when he's stuck in the cave-in? Tell me in the puzzle. When he gets caught in the cave-in, he tries to stop the dynamite from blowing up, right? He stops that fuse with his hammer. So he saves the day again. Some days later, they heard an unfamiliar clatter. Down the tunnel came a group of men with a strange machine. "This is a steam drill. It can drill more holes faster than any 6 men combined," a new man bragged. "Who can beat that?" John Henry stepped forward. "Try me." He and Lil Bill took their workplaces. John Henry gripped his hammer. Lil Bill clutched his steel drill. "Check the machine," came an order. A nervous hand fell on the switch. In the dark, both sides waited for the signal to start. A hoarse voice counted 1, 2, 3. The machine shrieked as it started. John Henry swung his hammer, and a crash of steel on steel split the air. Clang, bang, clang! The drill got red hot in Lil Bill's hand. He quickly dropped it and picked up another. Hiss, whistle, rattle! Men frantically heaved coal into the hungry, roaring engine and poured water into the steam boiler. Whoop, clang, whoop, bang! John Henry's hammer whistled as he swung it. Chug, chug, clatter, rattled the machine. Hour after hour raced by. The machine was ahead. "Hand me that 20-pound hammer, Lil Bill." Harder and faster crashed the hammer. Great chunks of rock fell as John Henry ripped hole after hole into the tunnel wall. The machine rattled and whistled and drilled even faster. Friends doused John Henry and Lil Bill with cold water to keep them going. Then John Henry took a deep breath, picked up 2 sledgehammers, and sang, "Ain't no hammer strike such fire, strike like lightning, Lord, and I won't tire. Hammers like this, Lord, there's never been. I'll keep swinging 'em until we win." John Henry swung both mighty hammers faster and faster. He moved up fast. The men could see only a blur and sparks from his striking hammers. His strokes rang out like great heartbeats. At the other side of the tunnel, the machine shrieked, groaned, and rattled and drilled. Then all at once, it shook and shuddered, wheezed, and stopped. Frantically, men worked to get it going again, but they couldn't. It had collapsed. John Henry's hammering still rang and echoed through the tunnel with a strong and steady beat. So who won? Suddenly, there was a great crash. Light streamed into the dark tunnel. John Henry had broken through. Wild cries of joy burst from the men. Still holding one of his hammers, John Henry stepped out into the glowing light of a dying day. It was the last step he ever took. Even the great heart of John Henry could not bear the strain of his last task. John Henry died with his hammer in his hand. If you listen to the locomotives roaring through the tunnels and across the land, you'll hear them singing of the great steel-driving man, John Henry. Listen. So what is the last event in this story? What is the last thing that John Henry does as he's working in the tunnel? Tell me in the puzzle. So we learn in these last few pages that he races with his friend Lil Bill against that steam drill, right? So he's racing to drive holes into that rock to make that tunnel. And that's where we learn the history of the Big Bend Tunnel. So as we are thinking about what has happened in this version of John Henry, we need to think about the features of this book. So this book told a story about the life of John Henry as a legend. What was the best feature of this book, in your opinion? What was the best feature of this book? Did you think that the story was the best feature, the character of John Henry, the illustrations? What do you think was the best feature of this book? Tell me in the puzzle. So I think the best feature of this book is how the story told the entire life of John Henry from the day he was born to the day that he died. I loved how it told about how much of a hard worker he was and how he saved lives multiple times with his hard work. So we listened to this book for a second time, and we were able to get a closer look at the words and illustrations and have a better understanding of what was happening. How did the words and illustrations help you understand the legend of John Henry? How did the words and the pictures help you understand what was happening in the story? Tell me in the puzzle. So thinking about this question, I know it's a really tricky question to think about, but think about how we use illustrations to help us understand what is happening in the book. The illustrations matched what the words were saying. And the words told us about all the important events or things that John Henry did. So let's look at our story map right here. So we started by talking about the setting. When and where does it take place? We know that the story takes place the time that John Henry was born, and it took place outside John Henry's home where the animals were watching and waiting. We know that the main character of the story is John Henry. So the beginning event was when John Henry was born, and he was born with a hammer in his hand. This is a very important part of the story because we learned that John Henry does a lot of his work with a hammer. So there was that first event, that beginning event. The next event is that he worked on that riverboat and he saved people's lives with his strength and with his might. We also learn that after he helped the people on the riverboat, that he went on to work on the railroads. And we learned that he had his hammer in his hand and he was working on that steel. He was working on those railroads. And as he was working on the railroads, he was able to save men in a cave-in and stop dynamite from exploding in the cave. What in the end event was that he beat that steam drill. He raced that steam drill machine with 2 hammers. But at the end of the story, we learned that he died from all that hard work. So, looking at the events in this text, what is something that we learn about John Henry? What is one thing that you learned about John Henry with all of these events? What is something that we have learned about his character or what kind of person he is? Tell me what you're thinking in the puzzle. So, something that I am realizing about John Henry is that he was very brave. He was a very brave person. He was willing to do dangerous things to help people. There was another legend. There's another 2 legends about characters that are willing to sacrifice and do things to help people. Johnny Appleseed and She Who Is Alone. So this legend teaches us that John Henry was a brave man who was willing to do scary things, to do hard things to help people. All right, and as we wrap up our lesson with a deep dive, we're going to be talking about how we can use collective nouns in our writing. Now, remember, yesterday we did some imagining. We closed our eyes and thought about these collective nouns and what they would look like. So, writers use collective nouns to help readers paint a picture in their head of what is happening, of what these collective nouns look like. So you are going to have a chance to help me match these collective nouns to the group of plural nouns that match with it. So I am going to go to the screen and we are going to, we're moving. We're going to match our collective nouns to plural nouns. So a herd is a collective noun that describes what? Look at these plural nouns. What is a herd a group of? Look at your options right here. We have soldiers, birds, fish, buffalo, Native Americans, and trees. What is herd a collective noun for? It's a collective noun for buffalo, right? So if we close our eyes and we said there was a herd of buffalo, we would know that is a large group of buffalo. It gives us more details about the buffalo and how many buffalo there are. All right. So that is what we're going to do for the rest of this deep dive. I am going to give you a collective noun. And in the ed puzzle, I want you to tell me, what is that collective noun a large group of? All right. So tribe. Tribe, is that a collective group of soldiers, birds, fish, Native Americans, or trees? Tell me what a tribe is. A tribe is a large group of blank. So a tribe is a large group of Native Americans. And we've learned about that through our time with reading about the Plains Indians and the book, The Buffalo Are Back. All right, the next one, a forest is a collective noun for a large group of blank. Tell me in the puzzle. So a forest is a large group of trees. That is a collective noun. A forest is a large group of trees. It's not just a few trees, it's maybe hundreds of trees. So when we think of forest, we think of big pieces of land covered in trees. All right, this next one, flock. A flock is a group of blank. Look at your options. What would a flock be a group of? A flock is a large group of birds. Remember learning about flocks in Module 1 when we talked about how they migrate for winter? So cool. Look at all those connections. All right, army. Army is a group of blank. Tell me in the puzzle. An army is a group of soldiers. And our last one, we can do this one together. A school is a large group of fish. What a cool name. So a large group of fish is called a school. So when writers say there was a school of fish moving through the water, we can paint a picture in our head of like hundreds or thousands of fish moving together through the ocean. All right, Smarties. So, as we are learning about John Henry, start thinking about collective nouns that you can start thinking about using for your next writing task. How can you use collective nouns to make your writing more interesting? All right, Smarties, that is it for Module 2, Lesson 27. Remember to keep that growth mindset. Good learners do hard things. And remember to be brave in your learning. All right, Smarties, I will see you tomorrow. Happy learning.